Please don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment for future content.
It's really interesting. So the idea behind a question like this is not to highlight who the morally sound or morally fibrous are. What we're looking at is recognizing that people are different, and it's an important factor when it comes to self, especially through coaching and coach education. We have to understand and appreciate difference, and that's one of the key bits. Not only difference, but also how we go about achieving set things throughout the next sort of hour. So understand that each other are different and try and take some ideas based on the differences that we are lucky to have in the room or the virtual room we have. So when we go into the breakout rooms, we're gonna have another go at it later on. But there's some rules that I'm going to ask you to adhere to in the breakout rooms, or some guidelines that I want you to try and follow. So in the breakout rooms, make sure you ask at least one question, get involved in it, be active, share at least one idea with a group. So those were the options that you had. Were potentially you could have maybe come up with your own option. So move forward, leave with one thing to try as we go. So I know it's going to be difficult to put any of this stuff that we're going to talk about today in action physically on the grass, but leave with one thing that you might want to try when lockdown is finished. And leave with at least one connection or one person that you can make contact with, because the groups will be randomized and we'll swap it up again. So post this event, maybe try and follow somebody on social media, because there are some really interesting people that we've got in our virtual network tonight. So like I said before, there is a rationale as to why we're doing what we're doing in terms of the format of coach education, or the format of coach support would be a better way of looking at it. So when you look at the models that are being used at the minute, often what we would be classified as is probably or potentially infotainment. What you are getting is you are getting lots of information, but you're not really getting a chance to digest it. You are sitting there almost in a virtual lecture. Then at the end of the lecture, you get to close it down, go away, consider putting it into action, but not necessarily getting to discuss it with a peer. So that's part of what the model that we want to adopt tonight, starting with a clear rationale as to why we're doing what we're doing. And it's more of a social network for coaches. And it's not only going to take this form that we've got tonight. The idea is that we adopt a different form for different events. So for example, one of the things that we might look at, which worked really well when I was in charge of the mentor program, National Development Days, one of the areas for that was around TED Talks. So what we recognize is that we had 330 mentors. It's clear that we had a really skilled and expert workforce. So it made sense to have TED Talks or TED Talk style events where mentors who have got brilliant experiences and ideas worth sharing would decide on a topic and a theme or an area that they were potentially a bit more expert than others in, and they would deliver. So that's one of the things that we could potentially do through this virtual platform. And you could maybe just say, look, I'm interested in these two, listening to these two workshops on one evening, maybe 20 minutes each. So you go with almost sound bites and snippets of content that really sparks your personal interest. The other idea is almost like having a football cafe that you're at home. So on a Friday evening or a Monday evening, or when there's no games going, and we are trying to look for stuff where there's no games, which is why Anthony's workshop is on Monday. When there's no game and you want to just have a chat about coaching and football, potentially we could open up the Zoom call that we've got tonight and just go, look, we've got 100 people, stick them in some virtual rooms and they can just have a chat with some random people about football and coaching. And the idea behind that is that social network, the bit that you're not getting at the minute because you're not able to interact with other coaches in clubs, and just to share ideas and take some ideas from other people. Like I said, we know that we have got some brilliant people in the room, and it's an ideal opportunity to try and learn from them in a way that's different to what you might be able to do through social media, through tweets, where you can't really interact and engage with people and draw some detail down from the ideas and expertise that they've got. So that's the plan. But if any of you have any ideas on how we could maybe work collectively as a group, please share them, drop them in an email, drop them in the chat box. If any of you want to get involved in delivering anything, please get in touch, because quite frankly, I'm sure you don't want to listen to me too often. And I would like to sit on the other side and listen to other people as well. And I know we've got some brilliant people who've already expressed an interest. So Tony McCallum, who many of you will know or will have been influenced by Tony. So Tony was in charge of the FA Coach Education Program I think it was from 2007, around that time, and has been National Coach Development Manager. I contributed to content around UEFA B and A license, and Tony's quite keen to get involved and deliver some stuff. So likewise, we've got people who worked locally, Gary being one of them, Mark Haining being another one, Rich Horner from the professional game. They've all expressed an interest in getting involved. But the one thing that I would say is the expertise doesn't always come from people in those fields. It might come that you are more of an expert in epistemology. So we had mentors who came in and took the language around some of the academic language and made it less complex so that people were able to understand it and use it in context. So please get in touch if you've got some ideas worth sharing. So I mentioned tonight that the idea was to look at some information around self. So I'm just going to highlight what that model looks like. So when it comes to the competency framework, it's been adopted across Europe by UEFA as the model for reality-based learning. So there are 4 elements: self, learner, environment, and game. Self essentially is discussing the coach element of the game. So when you look at where you are in relation to self, there are different levels when it comes to the coach competency framework. So, for example, and I don't always agree with the language that's used in terms of the competency framework, and it's not necessarily used as an assessment tool, but formal language in the document is labeled as at level 5 UEFA Pro license. A level 5 coach is self-aware and can assess their own strengths and weaknesses. Now, I know lots of level 1 coaches that can do that effectively, and I've learned from level 1 coaches personally. So the competency framework doesn't always fit when it comes down to being fit for purpose in terms of an assessment tool, because it can be open and it can be very ambiguous. So one thing that we need to be aware of is, as coaches, is where we are in terms of our own learning journey, and how we can evidence that in terms of not only progressing through courses, but develop ourselves moving forward, to recognize where our skills lie and where we have some knowledge gaps or skills gaps. So an image that I really like that highlights this is this one. So for me, if you look at my role as a dad, so I'll take it away from football. My role as a dad, I'm only 12 years old in terms of the role of as a dad. And that might sound a bit crazy, but I'm still massively learning what my roles and responsibilities are every day. And it's changing forevermore now that my daughter started secondary school, and she's starting to experience massive changes. And I'm having to revisit lessons that I haven't studied in 20 plus years. So it's not been easy for me as a dad to recognize that although I'm a lot more experienced than other dads, I'm only 12 years old into that journey.
How you say things. If you say, why don't you have a shower instead of what you're doing?
Just to mute it. So when it comes down to politely, it's still... When it comes down to other areas, maybe playing football, I'm more adult, if you like. So I've been playing football for 34 years. So I'm grown in terms of that, and I've got lots of experience and I understand how to do it, and I'm quite efficient with it. I've often been described as Berbatov on ketamine. So I've managed to learn how to do very little work, but do quite a decent job when I play. So I'm quite efficient and effective. Other areas that you might say I'm at the other end of the spectrum, almost being a baby, is my new role. So I've recently taken on a new role, a new job after leaving the FA, and I'm learning every day, and I'm almost starting from scratch in that, and I'm almost using my hands and learning what it feels like to get stuck in terms of that role. And what I would stress to you guys as coaches is to recognize where your knowledge gaps are and find a mentor that can help you develop those. And now the rationale behind that, when it comes to understanding where your knowledge gaps are, is a real simple one. There's not one way to coach. If I asked you to get from Embankment to Waterloo, you would potentially find maybe, I don't know, 25 different ways to get there. Some of you may go by boat across the river. Some of you may end up using the underground to go there. But there's no one way. Now, when we look at coaching and coach education, what we often find is it can be very much down to the lens that somebody looks at our session through. And when it comes to learning from peers, there's something that I've picked up massively from my personal development through being in the mentor program. And it's a key saying, it's distance doesn't separate us, silence does. We are not good in the coaching community at sharing ideas and sharing resources. And the one thing that I would ask you to do is share ideas, share your resources as much as you possibly can. And I'm going to do that tonight. And I'll show you what that looks like at the end in terms of a physical resource. But I would urge you to share stuff, be as open as you possibly can, because there isn't only one way to do it. And even if you are successful and you are doing it and you are having a lot of success, that might not necessarily be down to you. It might be down to the players that you've got. And I stress that because of a conversation I had with a guy called Eric Harrison, who worked at Manchester United with the class of 92. And he was talking about players like Giggs and Scholes and Beckham. And his famous saying when we had the conversation, I've referenced it many times, is he turned around and said, I don't know if they made it because of me or in spite of me. My job as a coach was to not make them worse. And it's really simple. But he was somebody who would always look to see what other people were doing. He would always go the extra mile, and he would always try and come up with something a little bit different. He would consider himself a little bit of a scientist, and he would look to be experimenting where he possibly could. So don't be afraid to share your ideas, even if they're a little bit controversial. Now, the one idea that I had that was a little bit controversial on social media was around the need or the use of time for warm-ups in children that are not in the foundation phase. And for me, if I'm coaching a grassroots team, and I've done it for many, many years, I never used to get them to warm up, because it was not in the physical way that we would traditionally classify as a warm-up. Part of the reason for that is I'd only normally end up with an hour and 15 with them at most. And often I find coaches, when I go and work with them in grassroots settings, they spend a lot of time warming players up, but they never warm them down. They don't do any of the stuff that would potentially prevent an injury away from the session. And the rationale behind my controversial idea of not necessarily using a warm-up, and some people find it controversial, was, well, I never see kids warming up in a playground in primary or secondary school. And then I go back to, well, how many of them are getting muscular injuries in those settings? So I tried to look for some evidence on either side to be able to come up with an argument, and it was really difficult to find a balanced argument or an academic argument for either way or either approach, because people haven't done too much research into that. But don't be afraid to share your ideas, because what it will do is it will create discussion, and it will hopefully create people who are independent thinkers and decide to look at things maybe in a different way. Now, when it comes to looking at things in a different way, every time you go and coach, you have a choice. You decide what you're looking for when it comes to the players that you are going to be working with. You decide what approach you are going to have when it comes to how you shape those players. And every interaction that you have with the players matters. So from your perspective as a coach, yes, it's important to be aware of your own self and be aware of your own behaviors. But just remember, whatever behaviors you enforce on those players are going to leave a lasting impact. And that's the bit sometimes that we forget about. So when it comes to CPD, more often than not, in terms of academic evidence would suggest post a CPD event, what would happen is you would normally get a survey or some sort of follow-up questionnaire that says, how was your CPD event? Did you enjoy it? What was the tutor like, etc.? Nobody ever turns around and leaves it a little bit of time and asks the learners, what was the impact of your CPD? Because that is the purpose of professional development. If you are looking to improve yourself, the reason you're looking to improve yourself is ultimately going to have an impact on the players that you work with in context on the grass. But no one ever follows that up. No one ever does research around the players that you work with. So it's really important that you understand that your journey as a coach is entwined with the learning journey of the player. So often what will happen is the coach's learning will come potentially at the expense of the players. Not always, but sometimes that does happen. So as a coach, we need to be conscious of our own ideas and the things that we try and the impact that that has on a player. So please bear that bit in mind, because it can be detrimental to the players if we're learning about appropriate behaviors potentially to adopt, or how to manage situations effectively, or what practices we might use. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge detrimental effect, but it potentially could be, and it could put one player off. So being aware of your own philosophy is massively important as we move forward, and being conscious of the things that have shaped your philosophy. So on that point, when it comes to self, when we've got UEFA B learners in now, the first thing they're asked to do is a pre-course task. This is not their task. This is an academic version of the task. But they are asked to do a pre-course task, which asks them to identify over a number of years influential moments, and it could be personal or professional. So in terms of an academic version, in 2017, I started a PGC course. And one of the first tasks that we were asked to do was read this paper, and it was tracing exceptional career pathways in coaching and mentoring. And it was around American collegiate female coaches. And we were asked to come up with our own roadmap, if you like. And that's my version there that you can see. And the orange ones will be some professional experiences I've had, etc. And I mean, you can have a look at it later on. I'll send everyone a copy, so it's not a big one. I'll also send you the academic paper so you can read that as well, because some people will obviously enjoy that. But one thing we ask people to do is recognize what are the massive influential milestones that hit you on your way to shape who you become. And if you don't ever look back on those, sometimes you're not consciously aware of the behaviors that you adopt and potentially why you adopt them. So I know through conducting this piece of work that between the years sort of 2012 to 2014, I was shaped massively by people around me, not necessarily by coach education that I undertook. So I was really fortunate enough to have somebody called Dick Bate as a mentor, and I'll talk a little bit about Dick in a little while. I was really fortunate enough to have somebody called John Gittens, who sadly also passed away, as a line manager, and they shaped my personal learning journey in a huge way, probably more so than any of the formal coaching content that I received on courses. But before that, I was really fortunate enough to learn from people who were working under me in the skills program. So at one point, and it's highlighted in there, one point I had Eduardo Rubio, who many of you will know, Anthony Limbrick, who I've already highlighted. Eduardo was an assistant manager at Crawley recently, UEFA Pro License coach. Dean Smith is in charge at the Premier League in terms of the games program. Anthony Limbrick, who obviously was at Grimsby, and Callum Martin, who is one of the best underrated coaches that I've seen in a while. Mark Timmington, who was working with the youngest age groups. He was an absolutely fantastic coach. And there was 6 of us in the team, and I was really fortunate to be able to learn from people who were working underneath me. And that's the one thing that I would always stress. Don't consider titles or qualifications or badges as potentially places where you need to go and learn. So from yourself, go and look at where your knowledge gaps are, maybe find out what they are from other people. And it might be by conducting surveys with your players or with your parents that you work with or other coaches that you interact with to find out where your knowledge gaps are and then go and act upon it. So I knew if I wanted to go and find out more about technical and tactical detail, I would go and speak to Anthony Limbrick, because that was something he was really good at. And it's proven because of what he's done with his career so far to date. I'd have conversations with Mark Timmington about working with the youngest age groups. I'd have conversations with Callum about managing behavior. So whenever I needed some advice or guidance, I would go to somebody who I would consider to be more expert than me in those areas. And that is a challenge that I would ask you guys to do, not to feel like you're alone. We have a community of coaches, but the big one that I've already highlighted is distance doesn't separate us. Yes, we are in lockdown. Yes, we are miles and miles away from each other, but we still have access to communication through Twitter, through things like Zoom. So please remember that saying, distance doesn't separate us, silence does. If we don't communicate, we're not going to be able to use the tools and technology that we have at our disposal in order to be able to continue learning for the benefit of the players. So I've gone backwards. When I look at the model that was adopted in the mentor program, one thing that we always spoke about was not creating clones of ourselves. And that meant mentoring up and mentoring down. And one of the things that stood out for me was that everyone that I come across has the potential to be the next Man United manager, you know, and I mean that loosely. I don't mean that Ollie's going to lose his job anytime soon, but I come across people every day who have got unbelievable skill sets and different skill sets that would add value to the professional game. And that doesn't necessarily mean right now, but it might be in a future. So if you're looking at people that have got those skill sets, some of them have all 3 and they're able to inspire, empower and educate other people. Some of them have 2, but they're working towards the educational tools. Some of them are brilliant mentors and some of them are brilliant coaches. One thing that I would say is we're all lucky enough to be able to access some brilliant online resources. The key bit now is to try and personalize the online resources, because that's the bit that had the biggest impact on me, I believe. So I was lucky to have Richard Horner, who was my boss, who then went on to become a pro game educator at the FA. But I would constantly ask him questions. And when I left Rich, I would always leave with more questions than I had answers. And that is the key bit that I believe going forward is going to help you understand yourself. You've got to go and ask people some questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And that's one of the tasks that I've set you for the breakout rooms as we go later on this evening. Make sure you're asking. Everyone needs to ask at least one question. The king of detail, in my opinion, and who had the biggest impact over me and many coaches around developing themselves for the better through that model that I mentioned a minute ago, where you look at the greatest good you can do for another is not just to share your riches, but to reveal to him his own, was Dick Bate. Dick Bate was a master at making you think or helping you think in a different way to other coach educators. It wasn't just here's some resources, go off and copy these. He would challenge you. He would come up with different models and concepts. Some of them you will all be aware of. So Dick Bates' 4 S's for defending: shut down, slow down, sit down, show down. You probably have heard those from other coaches and you didn't know where it originated from. Those are Dick's work. That's one of the ways that he really liked to work. Now, in terms of learning theory, one of the key bits for me is I learned because I was in that environment. I was very fortunate to be in that environment for 13 years and be around people like Dick Bate and steal ideas and share ideas with him and bounce some off of what he was currently doing and then taking it and adapting it. So when it comes to alliterations and using certain letters, that was something that I stole from him and I use and I've adapted, and now I've got my own version of it. Somebody else that you can see in that picture is a guy called John Gittins. So John sadly passed away as well as Dick. And John was somebody who I looked for different details. John was more around, he was an ex-professional, not that long retired, and would give the nuances of the game, technical and tactical detail. Dick Bate was more of a coach educator and a coach developer and would challenge me to come up with different ways to get my lessons, my methods across, whereas John would help me come up with the technical and tactical detail that I'd be trying to get across, the communication. So they would help me in different ways. And that's the one thing that you should be looking for, is which people can you use now to draw upon in order to be able to develop yourself moving forward. And like I said, when I'm looking for information now, I don't have Dick to go and speak to. I don't have John Gittins to go and speak to because they've sadly passed away. But I would go and talk to Richard Horner. I would talk to Anthony Limbrick as often as I possibly could as a source of good technical and tactical information. The other guy that you would see at the bottom of the screen is a guy called Niall Harrison. And he is one of the best coach educators and coaches that I've come across. And he works over in Ireland and lives over in Sligo. He's not on social media, unfortunately. But if you ever get a chance to go and watch Niall work or find some of his videos, Niall Harrison is an excellent coach and an excellent coach educator when it comes to technical and tactical detail. He goes into the most minute detail, and I'll share a tweet that Niall helped with me, and I'll share it after this. Niall helped me look at an overlap back in 2012, and we went through some real fine details around it, and it was really simple. But he was talking about, playing the pass a little bit softer. The reason for playing the pass a little bit softer was so that you could run and catch up with it. But you see so many overlaps where people play a pass so fast that they can't actually catch up. So the weight of the pass, the angle of the pass onto the winger's foot, then the winger driving inside at the inside shoulder of the person that they're attacking. They're deliberately attacking that shoulder to create the space on the outside, but real tiny little details around the game. So I'll share the tweet with you, but these people have had massive influences on me. Now, the question I would have to you is, who's had an influence on you? And are you aware of the influence that they've had? So this image, and I like to use images when I deliver, but this image is really powerful. This is of Durdle Door down in the south of England. And the way that I look at it is every interaction matters. And I mentioned this before around the players that you work with. But if you take that image and you look at every person that you've come into contact with is potentially a wave. They are shaping you, they are sculpting you, they're adapting the way that you see things. And that's the way that I would describe some of those best coach educators that I have worked with. They have shaped and sculpted me into who I am today in some areas, whereas other things have shaped and sculpted me to who I am. So personal things that have happened, you know, like becoming a dad, that changed the way that I see lots of things. That changed the way that I look at learning and pedagogy, because I now see how some of that works in action at home, whereas I didn't see that all the time on coach education courses at the beginning. So think about the people that have shaped you. What have they done? What are the behaviors? You know, if it's the shaking hands. So I spoke to somebody recently who was talking about shaking hands, and they found it really weird at their club because the players now can't shake hands. And it was something that this coach had implemented at his grassroots club 3 or 4 years ago with his under 10 side, and they're now under 14s. And every time they see him, they would always shake hands. And even when it first came to lockdown, that was one of the things that the players always that were in a habit, was around shaking hands. So I asked him, well, why does that happen? Is it out of respect? No, it was just out of habit. It was something that happened to him in primary school, where he would always shake the teacher's hand. And then he went to secondary school, and again, it was very much around shaking people's hands. And he continued that. But he didn't understand potentially why people shake hands. So I asked him, well, why do we shake hands? So for some reason, we shake hands all the time. And when we start asking the question, why? Well, why does that happen? Often we start to look at, well, I'm not sure. I actually don't know why. And one of the questions that I always ask on a coach education course, and lots of people have heard me already ask it, but why do we eat turkey at Christmas? And I asked that question to promote some thought because of a question that my daughter asked me one day when I was sitting down having a Christmas dinner, and I didn't know the answer. And it's not as easy as just going, well, it's tradition. Well, there's actually a reason behind it. Normally you have more people around for dinner, so you require more food, so you need a bigger bird. And it does go into some elements of tradition, but there is a reason, and we should be looking at, well, why? Why is that the case? Why do we do what we do? And as a coach, how do you know what you know? And it will often come down to modeling. I've mentioned a little bit about it earlier through Bandura's learning theories. We're looking at modeling. We go off and we see what other people are doing, and often we will replicate it, or we will adapt certain things that we see other people do. And when we look at going on coach education courses, more often than not, I can tell when somebody has recently been on a coach education course with a tutor that I know, because they adopt studentship and they're not always authentically themselves. And this is the bit around self. Be the best version that you can be of yourself, rather than trying to mimic and copy other people's behaviors or other people's ways of working. So when it comes to your philosophy is your philosophy, and it should be flexible. It should be a balance between being practical and being realistic. You can't turn around and go, this is my philosophy, I'm going to be really rigid with it. A philosophy should be written in pencil and not ink, as cited by Mourinho. If any of you have seen the video of Mourinho, I can't use the video on here because the bandwidth, I think it would probably crash the system. But the video is unbelievably good when you see Mourinho talking about, well, what I would do with certain clubs and certain players. It's not just about having one way of doing things. So please bear that in mind. Now, when I came to writing my own philosophy, and I did write my own philosophy, and it took me a very long time to do it, I decided to come up with a model that would help me create it, rather than just writing down a wish list of things that I thought should be in there, or some buzzwords. So I decided to come up with this model, with the output being coaching. And that is the important thing to consider. When we look at philosophy is a precursor to action. It's the what, the why, and the how is all affected by our beliefs and our belief system. So we all have a set of values, and we would decide what they are. And then those values are lived and manifest through a set of behaviors. And those are players that we would often, or most often work with. They would potentially recognize what our philosophy looks like in practice. It's a personal statement that directs how we characterize and how we coach. But if you put your philosophy down on paper, would a player recognize that that was your philosophy if I put it into a bundle of everyone else's philosophy here? Because I honestly believe that I come across lots of coaches that walk a good philosophy, that talk a good philosophy, that don't necessarily walk a good philosophy. It's important that we believe and we live our beliefs if we are going to have a philosophy as a coach. Now, in that respect, I have some core fundamentals that I believe in. Now, when I look at, and some of you may contest this and you may disagree, when I look at different phases of the game, I have some words that transfer across all phases. Winning is part of it for me. Now, if you're looking at the foundation phase, winning is an element when it comes to my philosophy. And it's around competing to win. I'm not asking the players to win, and I don't expect them to win every week. But the reason that it's in there, competing to win, is if you look at the code of conduct, the FA's own code of conduct, what they literally word for word ask the players to do is try their best. In fact, I'll read it very quickly. So that always play my best for the benefit of the team. And that is in the young players' code of conduct. That is the opening statement. So all I ask the players to do is try and compete to win. It's not that winning is essential. As we progress through the phases, there is more emphasis placed on winning, but winning is not an ugly word. It's not a dirty word, and it shouldn't be discouraged. So there are other elements that you might see that jump through there. Equal playing time at youngest age group. And then as they progress older, there's a minimum playing time, especially if you go into away games, because I want the players to be able to play. They're still kids. They should still be enjoying it. But when we start getting towards the older age groups, then there's an earned playing time. And there's some bits in there around learning, etc. There's some bits in there around having free midfielders. Now, the free midfielders came about because of work I was doing with the FA Centre of Excellence team. So I used to be a technical director for Middlesex Girls Centre of Excellence, and our role, or my role, was to develop players that would play for England. Now, essentially, evidence at that time and evidence since has suggested that teams that win major tournaments have free midfielders. So when we played at under 11s and we played 7-a-side, we always had free midfielders. And the players would learn different roles and responsibilities in there. And when we talk about free midfielders, sometimes it would be a flat free. Sometimes we would try one holding. Sometimes we would try two deep. We would experiment and try different things. But we would always play with a variation of free midfielders, purely based on the fact that the role of the centre was to produce or develop girls to go on and play for England. Now, with that in mind, I had a model. I implemented a model that I wanted to try and affect. So getting players and coaches to understand core elements, again, like I mentioned about alliterations through using, through experience of working with Dick Bate, I decided to come up with a 3S model. So it was effectively around C, because I didn't want to use the word scan with working with little kids. I don't think they understand it. I don't think they really need to know that as terminology. It's just, what do you see? We should be really age appropriate with our language. So then we were looking at, so C be the first thing, then it would be the selection. That would be the next element of it. So what do you see? What do you select? That's the decision-making part. And then the last bit would be, how do you support? So that would be the next bit. So do you support the attack because you've passed it and we've retained possession? Or do you support the defense because we've passed it and we've lost possession, or you've dribbled and we've lost? So I had a real clear message. And the idea behind that was it would allow me and the coaches that I worked with to recognize where some players were breaking down. So it could be that they were struggling with the seeing bit, but once they got the ball under possession, they were then able to make a good decision. They were then able to support teammates. Some people that we would work with, they'd be able to see stuff really well and they'd check their shoulders, they'd get it, they would lose possession. So the decision wasn't great, but then they'd support the defense really well and work hard to win it back. But it allowed us to actually come up with a really effective way of developing players over that season. Now, as a result, I was only there for one season, but when I first went there, we had no girls in the England setup. And by the time that I left, we had 8 in one season, just by implementing one simple, effective method. And it was adapted through Dick Bate. He was the one that I bounced some ideas off. Now, the idea behind it is just to show you, this is not necessarily saying that's one way, that's the way you've got to do it. All I'm saying is there are ways to do it, and try and experiment and try different things and different models that would be easy for you to remember and understand, but equally easy for the players as well. So just on that, I would look at different ways of scoring. So 11 S's of shooting, and I would challenge the players every week to come up with different ways to score. And if they use one way, then they couldn't score the same way next time. but then it would come alive after that. So if they stabbed it into the goal with their toe, for example, they couldn't do that type of finish the following time. We had to look for different ways. Scuffy finishes, deliberately hitting the ball into the floor to make it hard for the goalkeeper, little scoops over the goalkeeper. So just coming up with different ways, and the players absolutely loved it. And the players were able to remember what the 11 S's were. So that's the idea behind coming up with little models around developing myself to have an impact on the players. So I was able to remember all of the S's, and I would use my whiteboard, and we would have different games that we would play on there, including football bingo. But that all came about through prior planning and having an effective model in terms of developing myself. So one of the things that I would often try and do is mind maps. And this is a digital version of something that I would often write down. But I would scribble down notes and how I would lose a defender. And I would do it all with the letter S. So I could stand still. I could use some strength to outmuscle them. I could run fast and beat them with speed, or I could beat them with a little trick and some skill, or I'd beat them with some deceptive, smart movement. So little S's, and I would challenge the players to try and remember some of these. So all I'm getting at is come up with little ways that work for you as a coach to help your players. And that's the important bit when it comes down to self. If you don't understand yourself and you struggle to be able to plan ahead, then potentially you are not going to be able to maximize the potential that you've got in your players at your disposal, because you're not fulfilling your own potential. And I know that we have got unbelievably talented coaches. I feel like what we need is slightly better teachers. That is my personal perspective. And I don't know if we're going to get that, because I don't think we have enough Dick Bates in the game that I was fortunate enough to be around, enough John Gittens in the game, enough Niall Harrisons that were able to help people like me help coaches and help players get better by designing different models. So those are some of the ideas that I've put forward. You don't have to use them, but what I would like to finish with is a little bit of consolidation. So we need to understand ourselves and the challenges that we face as we develop. So there was a period in my life in 2010 from the model where I did absolutely no learning whatsoever, because it was a really tough learning period, a tough period for me. I had a daughter who was born with a hip disability, and my nan passed away in that year in 2010. So I did no learning for myself, which then meant the players that I was working with at the time, they then didn't benefit. They got lots of replication of the same stuff. And I wasn't aware of that until I mapped it out, until I noted everything down and looked at the influences, the impact of the influences that year had on me, not only in that year, but in the following year and the year after that. So, but I'd still had the same group of players. So please understand the challenges you face will have a knock-on effect on the players that you work with. And that goes to the last point on the list. So your journey is linked to the player's journey that you come up with.